Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Andrea Kay, filling in for Kara McKinney. The Atlanta City Council is allocating $31 million in public funding to build a new training facility for police officers and firefighters, despite outcries from hundreds of left-wing activists who protested the move at City Hall on Tuesday. Democrat Mayor Andre Dickens approved the spending for the 85-acre center, even though opponents of the law enforcement and the project itself protested the funding for nearly 14 hours. But the opposition goes deeper than a single protest. Back in March, about 150 masked left-wing agitators stormed the construction site of the center and chased multiple police officers off the premises, while also setting fire to the construction equipment. 23 people were subsequently charged with domestic terrorism for the incident. And while one would think this is a rare instance, it's only one example of many recent clashes between Atlanta law enforcement and local anti-police activists. Ironically, the violence displayed in these protests against the site, which some call Cop City, highlights the need for a high-quality center to prepare the next generation of first responders. To that end, Atlanta will pay a total of $36 million over the next 30 years to use the center, on top of the $31 million needed to build it. It will ultimately cost about $90 million to complete. And that's why the Atlanta Police Foundation will also provide some of the funding to complete the project, which is desperately needed to recruit, hire, and train new officers or members of the fire service. In the meantime, local authorities should be aware of various rebel groups, such as Defend the Atlanta Forest, as these organizations appear to have been involved in some of the violent protests against the center in the past year. Joining us now to discuss is Dr. Tre Pennie, the president of the National Fallen Officer Foundation. Thanks for being here tonight, Dr. Pennie.
Of course, thank you for having me.
All right, so I'm baffled at why anybody would be protesting a center that involves first responders, and because it's not just first responders in the form of police department, it's actually the fire department. Do people not want their homes to have the fires put out?
No, you hit that right on the nail. Look, I'm just glad the city of Atlanta is even deciding to do something about the rising violent crime in that city. And I think this training facility is worth every penny that they're going to put into it to have officers that are better trained and equipped for the unconventional threats that they're facing this generation. Unfortunately, we happen to deal with riots and mass shootings across this country. But make no mistakes, it's not the good people that are protesting these training facilities. It's the anarchists and the radicals that want to see this type of death and destruction continue, because they want to go against the rule of law. They don't care about whether or not the people are safe in these cities. They care about destroying. And having a well-organized and coordinated police and fire department, it's going to disrupt their mission. It's going to disrupt what they're there to do. So look, I'm an advocate for police officers having the best equipment and best training, and we have to put more money across this country behind our law enforcement in order to be able to keep our cities safe. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. And look, you got to think about it. Since the construction of this facility, since like the early 2022, there have been multiple protests and riots at that facility, as you've shown on the screen. But think about it. There have been hundreds of people coming in to attack this facility that don't even live in Atlanta, but we've only had a dozen of them that have been prosecuted for domestic terrorism under state law. Now, you got to keep in mind, I testified before the Senate Judiciary back in July of 2022, and I asked for federal penalties to prosecute these individuals because the states have proven that they can't keep these individuals locked up behind bars. So with federal penalties, we can keep people locked up. Go look at it. I mean, 18 U.S.C. 2031. I testified before the Senate Judiciary. I asked for penalties associated with behaviors related to domestic terrorism because, unfortunately, there are none. And that's why I'm going to be running for United States Congress to actually put forward policies and penalties to lock these people up and get them out of our civilized society, because we need to be able to protect our communities and protect our police.
Unfortunately, I'm glad to hear that. Unfortunately, I don't think there's the will at the part of state, local, or even federal authorities to try to do anything to stop this. Because you're right. I mean, these are many people, and Atlanta's not the only city, by the way, that's suffering a crime wave, that's suffering attacks on law enforcement, including and first responders, as well as attempts to keep the public safe. And we've got to be wondering, who's putting the money behind this. This is just an offshoot of the summer of 2020, in my opinion. And we have to be aware and understand that the crime wave that's happening across this country is all intentional and it's by design. That's the anarchy is being funded by somebody, and it's not just a law enforcement issue in terms of getting these people arrested and thrown behind bars. It's also about seeing who's behind it and who's coordinating these efforts, because there's a long range game that's being played here, and I think that's part of what the mission needs to be on the part of officials, and everything from we need to get rid of the no bail policy, right? Here in the state of California, there was an announcement made by the governor that they weren't going to prosecute anybody who went in and stole up to $1,000 worth of products. There is an intentional crime wave that's happening across this country. Then when you add in the bad economic policies, and if you look at the cities that have the greatest crime wave, it's also Democrat-run cities that have had the worst economic policy that is reflected in the worst economic conditions for its people. So it's a larger, complicated issue, but I think it starts with just some common sense solutions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you the first place, I think a lot of people are overlooking the fact that these individuals are being radicalized on social media. Look, I filed the first lawsuit back in 2017 against Facebook, Google, and Twitter for facilitating the attack in Dallas, Texas, that claimed the lives of 5 of my friends, 5 police officers in Dallas during the Black Lives Matter riot. And my goal was essentially to bring attention to how these online radical agendas were actually influencing in real world attacks on our not just our police, but just on our infrastructure as a whole. And essentially, the goal was to revise CDA 230 to force these companies to be held accountable for their own content that they're posting online. But that immunity protection, unfortunately, we've just seen the United States Supreme Court has just kicked that case back to Congress because they don't want to touch it. They're allowing these social media platforms to have immunity for what third parties post on their platforms. But the reality is those companies are facilitating these attacks on our American infrastructure. And we have to do something in order to break this system. That's where all these groups are recruiting, they're radicalizing, they're fundraising. They're even fundraising to incite violence against our American government. And we have to do something to bring this system into check and hold these people accountable.
Yes, but I agree with you about the big tech, but it's also in our institutions. I think there was a local professor at Emory who was on board with the attacks on this center and said that this isn't an institution that has anything to do with peace or protecting lives. That's actually an insane comment by a professor who's supposed to be teaching religion. Look, I can remember when somebody, Atlanta councilman, I think it was Antonio Brown, wanted to defund the police to the tune of $73 million until he got carjacked, right? Then he started complaining about the police taking 45 minutes to respond to him. So, there's while you can still have some local people that are coming to their senses about this defund police movement, the institutions of the left want to continue to attack our law enforcement, and it's going to continue to put everybody at peril. How can people themselves as citizens step up to help in this movement?
Look, I'm gonna give you this. Everyone's an advocate until they become a victim. And the reality is, as people are being victimized and traumatized by the anarchy that are plaguing these cities, it's up to the individuals to step up and report the crime. They need to be working with law enforcement. You have especially there in Atlanta, right? You have a culture, and this is one of the cultures that I grew up with in Houston, Texas as well. But there's a culture of a lack of cooperation with law enforcement, because they believe that they don't want to be snitches, or they don't want to be the group that are going against the status quo. But you know what, guys? As long as you continue to take that position, you're going to continue to be victimized by these same people that the left are constantly recycling onto our streets, that are victimizing our communities, and we can't do anything about it. Everyone's an advocate until they become a victim. That is a reality. And I'm telling you, I hope that no one ever has to go through what we went through in Dallas, Texas, or anywhere else in this country, as it relates to dealing with the radicalized violence. But I'm hoping that people are paying attention to these trends that are occurring so that we can try to stop it, work with law enforcement, work with your government officials so that we can get enough police on these streets to actually stop the crime itself.
Absolutely. I come from Louisiana and Baton Rouge. Not long after Dallas, Texas, we lost 2 African-American police officers who were gunned down in a Black Lives Matter attack. And that's something that these leftists don't want to point out, is that many times the victims in these assaults on police officers are brave, courageous, patriotic people of color. And we need to continue to honor them. And we need to make sure there's facilities like this that will prepare them to go out and face the threats out on the street. God bless you. Thank you for being here, and good luck to you in your campaign.